I'm going to hide. Great. So this was the exercise, as was pointed out by one of you. It was probably 10 minutes was probably not enough to work this exercise out. Nevertheless, it's a this is your if you take an information theory class, this is your standard exercise for working out what information theory is. You should do it. It will be educational. Okay. Now I want to move forward from this sort of standard information. Remember, my goal was to somehow use these kinds of evaluations, like the amount of information conveyed, to try to think about why you might want to distribute computation or the transmission of information in the brain, especially given that transmission of information is expensive, things like that. So I'm going to try to use the notion of mutual information, of information in general, to derive a law of diminishing returns that's going to cause us to conclude that you should break up your total information traffic in the brain into many pieces of a particular in a particular way. So here is the first simple example of that. Imagine that you have some neuron. This box is supposed to be the neuron. There are some inputs, whatever it may be, and there are some outputs. And let me suppose P sub j are the probabilities of the different outputs. So what do I mean by the probabilities of the different outputs? J goes from 1 through n. And so J here quantifies, enumerates the different patterns the neuron can use. It may be just spike and no spike, or it may be, 0001 and 0100. It could be the different patterns you're talking about that the neuron fires in. And let P sub j be the probabilities of these different things. Now, for the moment, if I forget about noise, just to keep things simple, then we see that the total amount of bits transmitted by this neuron is given by the entropy, this expression, sum on j of pj log pj with a minus sign. That's what we said earlier was Shannon's expression for the information that's being conveyed out here. Well, it's the number of bits, the total entropy being conveyed out here. Now, in any realistic system, there are constraints, right? So let's take the first simplest sort of constraint that you might imagine. Let me suppose that every one of these emitted symbols has a cost to you. We can call it energy in analogy with physics, but it's any cost, whatever the cost may be. So for example, this is actually very, very reasonable. If you look at the recent paper of Levy and Calvert and PNAS, so the older work of Atwell and Laughlin, you will find out that every spike you use costs you money, costs you ATP, and this is the principal cost of operating the brain. So you could imagine that each of these patterns of activity has some cost E sub j, right? And E sub j is some function of j of the different patterns which I haven't specified. So then the average cost, or energy, if you will, of this communication is going to be the sum on all the patterns of the probability of the pattern times the energy, the cost of the pattern. Now suppose what I want to do is I want to find out how much information can be transmitted at some given cost. And then I want to find out how to maximize the information I transmit per cost. In other words, I'd like to maximize my, if you like, bits transmitted per ATP consumed, right? That could be a reasonable idea for what you might want to do to create an engine inside your head that does computations at a minimum cost in ATP, given that I know that the computation in the brain is very expensive and the brain appears to use a lot of power. Okay. So how would you do this? So mathematically, you would set up this kind of thing where you say, well, I have the entropy, which is the amount of information being conveyed because there's no noise. Then I set up what's called a Lagrange multiplier, where beta is a Lagrange multiplier, and then I say E is the cost or energy, and E bar is the average cost that I'm allowed to use. And then I set up another Lagrange multiplier, lambda, with a constraint here that says that the sum on all the probabilities has to equal 1. So basically what you do in the method of Lagrange multipliers is, on the one hand, I want to maximize the entropy, the amount of information. So you take dg, you take the derivative dg dpj and set it equal to 0. And then to enforce the constraint that the power you use is E bar, you also require that dg d beta equals 0. And to enforce the constraint that P is a probability distribution, you need dg d lambda equal to 0. So you set up these three equations. That's the method of Lagrange multipliers. So you can solve this very easily. And if you work out what these equations are, you will find that it says that the distribution Pj, the distribution with which you should use the different symbols that the neuron can use, goes like e to the minus beta ej over some normalizing constant. This thing is the Boltzmann distribution, right? So you would be predicted to use then, if you want to, if I tell you you can use a certain average power, that's over here, and I want to maximize the amount of information you can transmit, then it tells you that you can, you will need to use this kind of Boltzmann distribution of different symbols, right? So that's the first statement. By the way, it's true that in the brain, in many neurons, that if you look at them, the firing rate distribution looks exponential. That's just a side remark. The next comment that I'd like to make that will become pertinent to our distribution of computation is that suppose instead I say that what I want to do is to maximize the power per bit, the bits per ATP, bits on the y-axis, ATP on the x-axis. Well, so if you, what just happened here? So if I plot out this curve, if I plot out this curve, if you do these maxima, if you maximize the information transmitted at different cost, you will find that this curve is convex down in this way. Later on, I'll explain why it had to be convex down. But if you just mathematically calculate this, you'll find a convex down curve. So if you take a convex down curve like this, and you want to maximize the bits transmitted per, if you like, power consumed or cost incurred, then, the bits per cost is the slope of a line drawn from the origin to a point on this curve. So you can maximize that slope by going to the special point, r star e star, which lies along the tangent from the origin. So this tells you that if you want to maximize the bits per cost in this curve, right, that there's a special operating point for this kind of channel that you should be at. There's a particular kind of power consumption, and there's a particular kind of information rate that will maximize bits per cost. Okay, so we should do this a little bit to deal with real neurons. You would need to do this a bit more seriously because there's noise. So you have some input, you have some output. What's more, the output, as we said earlier, may have a smaller bandwidth than the input. There may be fewer output possibilities, symbols, than the number of inputs. So really, what you should write down is a probability distribution for which outputs you get given different inputs, or you can reverse that and say what is the probability of the input given the output. And what you should really do is write down the expression for mutual information between the output and input, the same expression that we were talking about earlier, and then maximize it. Right? So you should find out how you should organize this computation, how you should organize the encoding of the input to the output, such that you maximize the entropy of the output, right, subject to the noise and subject to whatever the bandwidth of the output is. So you have to work out the full expression for the mutual information. So in general, this is analytically difficult unless you pick very special distributions over here. So if this input-output distribution and the noise is very special, then you can calculate this by hand. But in general, you have to use a numerical algorithm called the Arimoto-Blahut algorithm. And you'll again find that there's this convex down curve. So again, qualitatively, you can say, looking at this picture, that if you wish to maximize the information per cost, you should perch yourself as an operating point in this channel that's at the tangent from the origin. Okay, so I expressed all of this specifically in terms of power, energy, cost, and mutual information. But actually, we can argue that this has to be true on very general grounds. And then we'll argue from this then into why you should distribute your information across multiple channels, why you want to compute in a distributed way. So imagine that you have some information channel, right? So some engine that computes information. And now suppose you can transmit information at some maximum rate, call it I1, maybe some point here, if you pay a cost C1. So, I just give you, you have the amount of money you have is C1 per unit time. And you can, whatever, there's the optimal algorithm that you could use to produce information at a maximum rate I1. Now, also suppose that if you pay cost C2 bigger than C1, you can transmit information at a higher rate, I2, which is bigger than I1. It's natural you can transmit at a higher rate because you have more power, so you can do more things, you can use more symbols, etc. So that's the case. Now, so you have 2 points. C1 corresponds to I1, and C2, the second, a higher cost, corresponds to a higher information rate, I2. Then it's clear that if you're willing to pay the average cost, C1 plus C2 over 2, then you can transmit at least the rate, I1 plus I2 over 2, by dividing your time equally between the two codes. So the maximum transmission rate you could achieve if you have a cost C1 plus C2 over 2 that you can pay must be bigger than or equal to I1 plus I2 over 2. And with a little work, you can show that this inequality is bigger than, not bigger than or equal to. So by iterating this argument, you see, so what that basically says is, so for example, if I have a point here and I have a point here, and I draw a line between those 2 points, then at any intermediate location, you will be, the actual value of the amount of information you can transmit will be higher than the line between those 2 points. So what that argues by iterating this argument is that the information rate of necessity is going to be a convex function of the cost. It doesn't matter what the cost function is, it's going to be a convex function of the cost. And we're going to argue from this that you should distribute your information widely over many channels. So this is the way we do it. The fact that there is that information and cost are related in a convex way means that there is a law of diminishing returns. What does that mean? It means that if I say double the cost I can pay, I do not get back double the information. Clearly this curve is sort of convex down. So you double what you pay, you don't get back double the bits. So the information is some convex function of the cost. So the second derivative of the cost with respect to of g with respect of this function g with respect to the cost will be less than or equal to 0. So you can flip that around if you like and write the cost as a function of the information. So you might be interested in saying, well, I need to, for behavior, transmit at 3 bits per second or 8 bits per second. How much will it cost me? So you can convert the same equation, I equals g, as a function of c, as c of I is equal to a plus f of I, with the second derivative of f with respect to I being bigger than or equal to 0. In other words, the cost as a function of the number of bits you transmit will be concave as opposed to convex, where here I've included a baseline cost. To keep a neuron alive or to keep your computer on, you always have to consume some power. So that's the baseline cost A. So given this fact, so it's a very, very general thing then, that the bang for the buck, the information as a function of cost is going to be a convex function of this kind, or the cost as a function of information is going to be a concave function. So given this fact, this very general fact, how should we break up the information traffic into channels to minimize the cost required to send a fixed total amount of information? That's the kind of problem that, for example, the retina faces, right? There's a certain pipe coming in of visual information. Not all the photons in the world are relevant, but some of them are relevant. And the ones that are relevant are relevant. There's a certain amount of bits per second you gotta send from the eye to the brain in order to support behavior. So what you really want to ask is how you should organize that information. Whatever that information is, should I break it up into little pipes? Should I make a big pipe? What kind of thing should you do? And so that's what we're arguing about here. So suppose, given this very general picture that the cost is a concave function of the information, or the information is a concave function of the cost, let's suppose that you have k channels. You can break the total information up into k statistically independent channels. So you take the total information is then a sum of the information in each of k different channels. Here, I'm thinking like in the retina, there are 20 different kinds of ganglion cells. So this may be like each different kind of ganglion cell sending a statistically independent piece of information, like the color versus the position versus the how fast it's moving. These are all independent pieces of information, and you're breaking it up into that. Now, these are independent channels, so the cost also sums up between all of these channels. So I'm asking the question, how should you break up the total information traffic into channels to minimize the cost to send a fixed total amount of information? That total amount, the fixed amount, is fixed by your behavior. You need a certain amount of visual information. The only choice you have is how to break it up into different pieces. So by symmetry, if you want to optimize this problem, you'll find that at the optimum, all the channels will have the same rate and cost. So basically, each of these i's, I sub I, if you like, I sub j, is equal to the total amount you transmit divided by k, where k is the number of channels, and the cost will be k times the baseline cost plus k times this function, here, function of I, and the I, the total information rate, is divided by K. So you get F of I over K. So now we can optimize this. I want to ask how many different channels you have. If you want to make this concrete in the context of the retina, which we were talking about earlier, then this is like asking, well, the retina could have had 20 different feature detectors, or it could have 30, or it could have had 10, right? You can organize this in any way you want. My question here is, why did you wind up having about 20 different kinds of channels, parallel channels? That's the kind of question this is going after, right? That's what K would be. How many different channels do you have? So if you optimize the number of channels, you take dc dk and set it equal to 0, and you can just do the math here. And the answer turns out to be, it should be that 1 over k d log c dx must be equal to 1. So that's what it turns out to be the answer to be here. So we're going to break that up a little bit more, and this is what it says. So let's suppose, for example, that the cost is a power law, just to get some sense of how this works. So suppose the cost increases with the power x to the alpha. Then you can work out that the optimal number of channels is given by this formula here. It's not important what that formula is, but the point I'm trying to make is that you can work out in this formalism how many different channels you want in order to perch each individual channel at this optimal point that maximizes the bits transmitted per cost incurred. What this says is that the law of diminishing returns that universally relates information and cost necessarily drives the distribution of information across a diversity of channels, each operating at a typical rate. So in other words, one should expect that if the brain is an expensive tissue, and if computation and communication are expensive to you, that the channels will get organized in such a manner that they will have some typical operating rate, and then and will distribute their functions across that. Okay, so I'm going to take this interpretive framework and think about the actual retina in this language. Okay, so here are many different kinds of retinal ganglion cells. There's this is a guinea pig terminology: on brisk transient, off brisk transient, etc. And what's being shown is different kinds of visual inputs to the retina. These are saccades, where the eye moves in a jerky manner between one location to another location, right? As it fixates on different things. Then there's optic flow. Optic flow is when you're sort of moving straight forward and the whole scene flows behind you. Then there's object motion, where you're fixating at one point and there's an object moving around the scene. So what's been done here is 3 different kinds of visual inputs have been applied to the retina, and different kinds of cell types have been identified responding to these inputs. And what I'd like to show you here is these are raster plots, which means that there are 30 different trials, and each little row here is one of the trials. And what you see is these retinal neurons respond pretty reliably, right? Not perfectly, they're a bit noisy, to the presence of various things in their inputs. The on brisk transient cell goes brick, 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 brick. The brisk sustained cell goes brrr. The on-off direction selective cell, with response to is direction selective in the motion of stuff in the visual scene, goes blip, blip, blip. So they all have these characteristic firing patterns that are similar across the different kinds of visual stimuli. So you could ask, given the interpretive framework we suggested a moment ago, how and why is the total information traffic divided up between so many different types of channels, right? There are like 20 channels or something. So if you want to apply the same information framework to that, then the first thing we need to do is to measure how much each of these channels tells the brain, right? Because a priori, if you look at them, they look very different, right? If you look at this looks as though it fires occasionally. This one fires a lot. So you might think, for example, that these 2 cell types say a lot more to the brain than this kind of cell type, which doesn't say much, or it would look that way. So again, let me remind you about the things we said about how you calculate the information of a spiking neuron. So you imagine multiple repeats, and I'll break up time into blocks of different sizes. Let's say this is 20 milliseconds or something. And then what you do is, within each block, you look at the pattern of firing. So for example, this may be 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0. This is a word that's used by the neuron to communicate. And you can work out the probability distribution of all of these different words. That's the response distribution. And you can compute its entropy. That's the total entropy in the language of mutual information that we were talking about earlier. Then we can repeat the same input, the same stimulus to the neuron multiple times. And what would you find? You'd find that each time you get a slightly different response. So here you get three spikes, 2 spikes, 1 spike, etc. And so you can work out the conditional distribution of the responses of the neuron given the input, and then you can take its average, and that average is the noise entropy. So you can work out all of these things. So if I gave you a data set, and indeed the second part of the homework that I gave you, takes you first to generate a fake data set, with the repeats and all of this kind of thing. It'll produce a raster plot like this with fake data where you know everything about it, and then you can compute this kind of conditional entropy, which is the noise entropy and the total entropy. You take their difference, and that computes for you the mutual information between the output of the neuron and the input of the neuron. Now, wait. Here we go. Yeah. So this is what I mean. Now, there's one slight wrinkle in this that I want to alert you to. This is something you should go off and read about on a separate basis if you feel like it. So if you ever do this kind of computation for real, if you're doing data analysis, then remember here, I said here, I put in the, I said, oh, wait, you should make this kind of bin of 20 milliseconds and break it up into, little pieces. So you say, let's say that you make 5 millisecond time bins, and this whole word is 20 milliseconds long. So then you have 4 time bins of 5 milliseconds here, and you also discretize a spike train into zeros and ones. You could very well ask, right, why is that fair? And why doesn't your answer that you get in the end for the mutual information between the input and the output of the spike train, why doesn't it depend upon the size of this word, how many time bins you have? The way you deal with that is you compute this for, let's say, time bins, 4 time bins, 5 time bins, words of length 4, 5, 6, 7, like that. And then you want to extrapolate to k equals infinity, right? You want as if the whole thing is one big word. And so there are techniques for doing that, which are described here. There's some universal rule for how to extrapolate from small k to large k. And there's a nice discussion of this in a paper by Strong et al. In 1997. And there's a book with the title Spikes about the neural code. And those 2 references will tell you how to do this extrapolation. So if you're doing this in actual data analysis in your own lab, you should remember to do this kind of technique. But for the moment, we don't need to do that, or rather, I'm telling you that we're going to do that. Okay. So applying those techniques to the neural data, this is what you find. So here are many different kinds of neural types in the output layer of the retina. These are all retinal ganglion cells. They respond to different things. These first two types of cell types, the brisk transient and brisk sustained, respond to kind of bright and dark spots. The direction selective cells respond to motion of small objects from left to right, up to down, different kinds of directional motions. So there are many different types of cell types here. So here's what's being shown. This curve C of R and delta T is the capacity of the neuron. So there's you can show that suppose you have this sort of ideal neuron firing at some firing rate R, it's a perfectly encoding neuron, no noise, it's just sort of perfect in all the ways it does. The maximum amount of information you could transmit at a firing rate R is given by this formula where delta T is the time bin, let's call it the refractory period of the neuron. So there's a formula like this. So then using the techniques we just described, where you measure the information rate of neurons, you can show that all of these different neural types actually lie on another curve, which is about 26% of this, ideal neurons. In other words, all cell types are about 26% efficient for all naturalistic stimuli. That appears to be the case. Okay, so that's an interesting fact. It's as if they're all perched at a similar operating point. So you can use this to build up a budget for the information traffic along the optic nerve. So if you work out how many bits per second are being transmitted by each of these different cell types, and then you work out how many bits per spike each of them sends, that's sort of all in the 1.9 to 2.2 range. It's all a very similar operating point. Then you work out how many cells of each kind you can just work out an information budget for the entire retina. So it turns out that the messages transmitted from the eye to the brain are transmitted asymmetrically. So the less studied sort of sluggish cells that fire at lower rates are actually sending most of the information from the eye to the brain. And that's because, there are many more of such cell types. And then scaling this up to the human optic nerve, this data was in guinea pig, you can work out that the amount of information from the eye to the brain is about the order of an Ethernet cable. Okay, so now I'm interested in asking the question, why not use a single type of neuron to send all of this information over a single high firing rate axon? So, why have you broken up the information into all of these different types, right? Instead, what you could have done is you could have packed all of the information into a single kind of cell type. Going back to what I said at first, that you could do arbitrary computations using a NAND gate. You can use a single wire to encode all of this information in a more interesting way, and then allow Cortex to decode it. Well, so one possibility is because the cost of signaling increases non-linearly with the firing rate. So if you imagine the kinds of neurons that you actually have in the retina, there's this local edge cell, there's the brisk transient cell, they're firing at 4 hertz, 8 hertz, etc. And you work out how many spikes you need to use to, say, send 300 bits per second over this cable. You find that all the cell types in the retina have to use very similar numbers of spikes. So it's about 140, 150, 160. So it's very similar numbers. On the other hand, if you made a single cell type that fired at the combined firing rate of all the cell types in the retina, so about 40 hertz, you'd find, using the same efficiency numbers that we found earlier, that you would need almost double the number of spikes. You need many, many more. Now, as I told you, Atwell and Laughlin and Lenny and Levy and Calvert have argued that the dominant metabolic cost in neural signaling is associated with spiking. So it's very, very clear that this kind of organization, right, with a single pipe that's encoding all the information in a more complicated way, would be much, much more expensive in terms of the cost consumption, or just the sheer ATP consumption in the brain. So to really drill this down, what you'd like to do is to actually have measurements of the ATP consumption of individual cells, of all the different neurons in the brain. So that's something that's, people are starting to try to do. It's certainly relevant for things like fMRI, and people have now imaging methods that image the metabolic pathway. But here is a piece of information that suggests that these kinds of ideas along the right track to explain the operating point of all these different kinds of neurons. So one thing you can do is, of course, as everybody knows, so in cells of this kind, it's the mitochondria which are the energy factories. So one thing you could do is to consider the mitochondrial volume or mitochondrial membrane area as a proxy for the cost. So in these two papers, the authors went ahead and went to many different kinds of neural tracts and worked out how much mitochondrial membrane area there was as a proxy for the cost of using this neuron. And then they compared that cost to the firing rate of the different neurons and found an excellent match. So this suggests that what's going on is that, and then you can work out using a similar kind. And so remember earlier on, we argued that the reason that the operating point for a nerve tract would get set by optimizing the information per cost, and that there was this concave kind of information as a function of cost curve that would set that. So using these kinds of arguments, these authors proceeded to try to explain the operating point of the retina. The basic, there's some basic uncertainties because you don't quite know about the constant factors and additive factors that relate mitochondrial volume or mitochondrial membrane area to the actual ATP consumption in the cell. So there are uncertainties there. But up to that, they found some evidence that this is on the right sort of track. Now, I would like to ask the organizers a question. So the next thing I was going to do is to say, well, fine, we've talked about the transmission of information nerve tracts. The next thing is to try to take this to the next level, which is to ask, well, there are many different types of cells. Can we use this kind of information argument to explain how you partition the information between different kinds of specific cell types? So if you take the retinal output, for example, there are many cell types. How many should you have of one kind of channel versus another kind of channel? So that's a kind of work. So for example, very most simply, you could ask questions about, for example, if you have red, blue, and green cones, how many red cones, how many blue cones, and how many green cones should you have? if you have cells that respond to bright and dark spots, that's this on cells and off cells, how many of one kind and another kind should you have? And those are questions you can answer using these kinds of methods. But I seem to recall that you wanted to reserve the last 20 minutes for questions. I can pick up on this in the next lecture, for example. So I'd like to ask you what you want me to do.
Yes, I think we can stop here and take some questions, because I feel it's a little bit dense for the students, right?
Okay.
The arguments, the thing I think that there's you're using different notation, right? The G and sometimes capacity and sometimes information rate, right? These three things are all related to each other.
Yes.
And also this argument is quite general, right? It also does not depend on whether these channels are correlated with each other's or not, right? They or whether they are independent channels. That you will always have this concave function, which then you can elaborate upon that. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like the logical arguments the students can ask. Do you feel that it's any gap? Is anything that you don't quite understand so far? For example, I think that this argument you need to break into many different channels. I feel there's a logical jump in these two slides, and do you have questions on that, or do you completely understand the argument? Please, I think it's very essential that you understand things rather than we going through a lot of details. Yeah, understand one essential argument is already very good. Maybe let me point ask some students, okay? For example, Han, do you have any questions?
There's a question in the chat.
There's a questions in the chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you
The question is, can you explain what is capacity?
Yeah.
So capacity is an is a notion that says, so suppose you have this this unit that is supposed to be transmitting a certain amount of that can transmit information. It takes things from the input and extracts something from that and writes it in some way and sends it into the output. Now, there are ways of doing this stupidly, and there are ways of doing this cleverly. And depending upon the amount of noise in the channel, there's some maximum amount that you can convey. And that maximum amount that you can convey is called the capacity of a channel. That's by definition is the maximum amount of mutual information you can convey between the input and the output. And that's controlled by the sort of properties of the information encoding device, such as, for example, the amount of noise it has. Did that answer your question?
So all of you are familiar with Lagrangian multiplier, right? We don't need to go through these technical details, right? Yes or no?
Juan,
Yeah.
you told me that I should be more technical, this, that, and the other, because everybody.
No, it's great. Lois is asking this question. Yes.
Seriously. Otherwise, I would give this talk in a completely different way.
No. I think it should be fine. All right. Yeah.
But let's make sure, because if you're not familiar with that kind of technique, then I should definitely be doing this in a different way. So for my second lecture, I would like to know that. So is there some way for us to take a poll of how many people know what Lagrange multipliers are?
Yes, please raise your hand if you know. Okay, good. Okay, most of them know, so it should be fine. Okay.
So UD has an interesting question. So it seems it's easier to understand the notion of channels in a feed-forward processing framework. How does this relate to recurrent processing? So I think that this is a big weakness of everything that I said. So in fact, there's an even deeper weakness of everything that I said, which is that it was all phrased in the language of information processing. So I was expecting somebody would say, would ask as a question, I went on for a while about computation this and computation that, but then when push came to shove, I'm just doing information transmission or communication with this channel. I think that is a major weakness of what I said. And it's a major weakness of the entire field, because there are very few techniques available for doing these kinds of quantitative analysis of structural organization. Once you start talking about computation, certainly anything recurrent. So for example, so that I would pose as a challenge for the next generation. This is something needs to be done about this. How are you supposed to think about things if they're recurrent? And how are you supposed to think about things if you want to think about, if you go to a programming class, they will tell you, take your big task and break it up into these sort of logically separate pieces that can talk to each other in a flexible way. That is not the language I used. I used the language of maximizing bits per cost, which is very different from that. Right. And they may point to the same similar direction, but they're not the same thing. Oh, Chuan, yes.
It's similar questions, because when people talk about recurrent network, they're talking about its processing of information, which cause information loss, right? When there cause information loss, then there's this problem about whether information theory can be applied to this kind of like individual cortex or go beyond that, right? So it works really well.
Well, so I'm definitely going to try to argue to you in the next lecture that you can certainly apply the notions of information theory in cortex, and certainly it's valuable, but you have to apply it subtly. So no one says that you have to preserve information, right? Computation is about transforming information. So what the point you're making is that most of the formalism of information theory is about preserving the information.
Right.
It's not about cutting it away.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not about processing. So in order to use the formalism, it's a little complicated to try to use the formalism. I'll try to give examples in the next lecture. But I agree with you that also it feels like we need to work with a different formalism.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry, I missed something. So what do you mean by the most of the formalism is related to preserve the information? Could you give an example?
Yeah. So what I mean by that is a lot of it. So most of information theory, it's designed with phone cables in mind. So it's about transmission mostly. So you stick something in on one side of a pipe, and you want to ask questions about how much of it goes to the other side of the pipe. Whereas there's a lot of computation that's specifically about not sending everything, right? So for example, if you have a classifier, the classifier is not sending everything into it's compressing the entire input into a 0 or 1. So that's definitely not sending everything. So there's a question there of how you think about the flow of the, if I think in the language of a deep network, there's some flow of information layer to layer, and your goal in the end is to faithfully map this into two categories, 0 or 1. It isn't to send everything about the inputs. It's to send just their categories. So there's some modifications necessary of how you think about the information flow.
I see. Thanks.
Where is this 0.26 magic number comes from? I mean,
yeah. So that is a question to which I do not know the answer to. So this is referring to the statement that if you take the ideal transmission channel, firing with no noise and no correlations at some firing rate, there's some answer for how much could be coming out of a neuron. And if you measure sort of basically all retinal neurons under natural conditions, by the way, you can't just drive them with their chosen stimulus. It's under natural conditions. They're all at the same operating point, it looks like, 0.26. So where is this number coming from? So the first question to ask, so the blunt answer is I don't know, and I wish I did. And and somehow that 0.26, one would argue, is something having to do with the biophysics of neurons and how noisy they are, what their operating point, their characteristic is. So if you look at, you can look at data from other species. This was guinea pig. If you look at other species, including rabbits, salamander, etc., it's all numbers that are sort of around there. So there'll be some that's 0.33 in salamander and 0.2 something in the rabbit. And of course, there'll be some variation based on experimental technique. But I don't think that's an answered question. There's a magic number there, whose origin is just not known. Yeah. So and I don't know the answer either.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The students, any questions? The silence means there are a lot of questions, or there's no question. I think.
I think the silence means that there's lots of questions.
Right, let's process
There are
it.
lots of questions. It's hard to ask.
Let me pick some people. Yeah. For example, Hen, do you have any question?
Yeah, I also have some confusion at the operating points, the 26% efficiency. I'm wondering, I'm lost as well. We get this conclusion. So
At which conclusion? Which conclusion?
the 26% efficiency.
Where that came from?
Yes, I'm a little bit lost at that.
Okay, so that's an empirical statement. So it's an empirical statement. I didn't derive that, right? So I said that there's the ideal channel, which has no noise and no correlations. And I said you can use the mutual information measurement techniques that I was referring to earlier in the talk. That is to say, here's the retinal data, and there's a way of measuring the mutual information between the input and the output. So you just measure that. And I just made the empirical statement that the mutual information between all the retinal types for all the possible sort of inputs that were tried and its input lies at about 26% of the ideal retinal neuron, firing at that rate. So no one knows why there would be that number, and it varies a little bit between species, but it seems to be that there's a constant reduction compared to the ideal channel. So I don't know why.
Okay, thanks.
And I also have a question. I remember he is not getting the argument of this operating point. I think it's about this curve, right?
Yes. Let me repeat that argument. So that's a useful argument to repeat. So can I share my screen?
Yes, please.
So the argument is going like this. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So the idea is, first, I try to give you an argument that in complete generality, regardless of the biophysics of the channel and so on, that the information as a function of cost will be some convex down curve. So that's supposed to be a completely general argument based upon, I gave where was that argument? The argument was here, where, if I give you this cost, suppose you can achieve this rate, and this cost, you can achieve this rate, then you can surely at least achieve the rate halfway between the two by sort of dividing the amount of time you spend with each kind of code. So then in the end, if you have a convex down curve like this, and let's suppose there's a baseline operating cost A, and now I ask you, at any point along this curve, what is the information per cost, bits per cost? So the answer is, well, if I'm at this point, for example, to find the bits per cost, well, the bits is the y-axis and the cost is the x-axis. So I can draw a line from the origin to a point on the curve, and its slope tells me the bits per cost. So if I want to maximize the bits per cost, I should maximize the slope of a line from an origin to a point on the curve. Whichever point maximizes the slope is the most efficient point for transmitting information with this channel. And here, the channel I'm imagining is a neuron with its particular biophysics, whatever that biophysics may be. So here, clearly, if you want to be at a point on this curve, and you want to maximize the slope of a line from the origin to the point on that curve, then you should be at the tangent. So this tangent point, whatever that is going to be the most efficient place to put your neuron in terms of transmitting information per cost. That was the argument I was trying to make. Was that clearer?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I ask something? In that graph, we start
Sure.
from A, and if we are carrying no information, our entropy should be 0, and A should be 0, I guess, or
So,
not firing pattern.
okay, so that's a very good point. That's a very good question. So indeed, notice that when you are at this point, the information is 0. So you're asking, why is this offset from the origin? That's because all devices, and certainly neurons, have an operating cost. So even if a neuron is not firing, there are plenty of protein synthesis costs and other kinds of costs that it's doing. It's maintaining its vesicles, it's maintaining this and that. And that is a non-zero cost, and that's an offset from the origin. So in order to apply these kinds of this formalism to the distribution of information traffic on nerve tracks, two things that you want to know are indeed this baseline cost and the added cost per spike. Those are the two parameters you need to know. And those are things that people make estimates of, biophysical estimates of, but there isn't a direct measurement. Did that answer your question?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. By the way, in my next lecture, anytime anybody is puzzled about something, I would really, really be grateful if you would just interrupt me and ask. It's just much harder over Zoom to see if anyone is, I can't see all your faces because I only see, if I expand all your faces, I can't see my screen. So I can't expand all your faces. So I can't see your faces. I can only see one person. So it's super helpful if people speak up. If something is, if they haven't understood something.
Professor, I also have a question.
Yes, please.
About the offset, the A point. If the system on the brain doesn't have the input, it means the zero input response. So what about the information here?
So sorry, I missed part of that question. So could you repeat it, please?
Yes, of course. Is that you do not input anything stimulus into the brain, so it can be called the zero input response. So what can we see in the zero input response in this information cost graph?
Sorry, I'm not. I haven't followed the question.
I think the question is, if there's no inputs to these neurons, there's no sensory inputs, can we still apply information theory? How should we apply it? Is there any logical problem?
Not really. It doesn't have to be a sensory. Well, so first of all, you presumably don't just mean sensory input. It can be some neuron that's deeper in the brain. It takes other kinds of inputs. That's perfectly fine. So you just take the inputs to the neuron and the outputs from the neuron, and you understand how the inputs and the outputs work. You don't have to take a single neuron. You could work with many neurons, an array of neurons, and consider their collective firing rate, and they can have collective inputs from other parts of the brain and then go to the output from there. Now, of course, if the neuron is getting nothing, right, there's no input to it either from the world or from other parts of the brain, there's nothing for it to do, of course. And if it keeps firing anyway, then it's just wasting, it's just wasting its firing because there's nothing for it to process. Unless it has some internal state that it's trying to communicate, right? You could imagine a computational unit or a little piece of the brain. So here, if you generalize a little bit, and here I'm really talking in the language of single neurons to keep things simpler. But you could have imagined a little circuit consisting of n neurons that are really forming one little area of the brain or something that are acting. Now they can have an internal dynamics, right? So they could have no inputs, but they could sort of self-excite themselves through some internal dynamics. And maybe their firing then communicates something about the internal dynamics. So you could have information of that kind. But this goes back to one of the other questions somebody else asked, because information theory really is typically organized to think about there's an input to the system, and then there's an output. Yeah, but you don't. But I'm trying to say you don't have to think that way. You can think about the system with its internal dynamics, and then the output tells you something about the internal state of the system. You can certainly formulate things in that way. Did that help to answer your question?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
All right, there are two questions on chat room. Let me repeat it. If brains have the principles of distributed computation, is there a unit that decides the computational priority, synthesize the computation results from different parts? That's the first question. And the second is, if so, would the neurons always take information independently for computing efficiency purposes?
So let me take those questions one by one. So the first question has to do with the coordination of these different pieces and how they are supposed to work together. And there are certainly coordination mechanisms in the brain. There's no question about that, right? So, for example, there's sort of attentional mechanisms that will skew what this piece of the brain is attending to or not attending to, gating information, things of this kind. And there are other mechanisms, including, for example, neuromodulator release that will increase or decrease learning rates and organize things in different ways. That said, to some degree, the whole thing is self-organized. There's no central processing unit that's telling everybody, you must do this now, or you must do this now. So I do think that one of the interesting things to think about is that there isn't, in that way, a unit or part that decides that this computation by itself is the priority, that is the priority. There's guidance. So, for example, there are regions of the brain that set goals and motivate what you need to do and things like that. So your frontal cortex is definitely helping with planning and decision making. But the kind of signal that comes isn't one that says, now you do this, and you do this. There's a much more distributed signal, and all of these systems have to organize relative to each other. So, for example, a colleague of mine, former colleague of mine named Peter Sterling, who talks about a notion called allostasis, where he says that, as animals go through life, they have to change their goals, and when they have to change their goals, the entire system has to change its states at the same time. So collectively, all the different modules have to sort of cooperate with each other and realize that if this is changing like this, then this must change like that, and that must change like that. So that kind of distributed control is, well, we're not going to talk about it in my only 2 lectures, but that is actually one of the things I'm thinking about right now, about how you achieve that in a system like this, because everybody has to collectively change. So then there's a second part of the question, which says, would the neurons always take information independently for computing efficiency purposes? So that's a good question. Because, as I said, as we were saying, if you want to maximize the information transferred, it may be, I kept saying, everything has to be independent. So that's actually not entirely 100% true, first of all. So first of all, I should clarify that, for example, that in conditions of noise, it may be beneficial for you to use redundancy to fight the noise. So that's just a side comment before I get to the bigger question. So, I have some paper with 2 colleagues of mine, Gaspar Tkachik and Elad Schneidman, from some years ago, talking about networks encoding information using similar techniques. And there we argue that under conditions of high noise, so under conditions of low noise, the network should be organized to indeed make everything as independent as possible, right? Sort of in the language I've been using. But under conditions of high noise, the network should reconfigure to actually use the correlations in its input to increase the correlations in the output, because those correlations help you maintain reliability in the face of noise. So that's one example of the way in which you don't always want to be actually independent. That's under conditions of low noise. But more generally, depending upon how you've broken up the computational functions, you may need correlated or coordinated action from different modules to produce some function. So in that case, you definitely don't want to be independent in that way. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Can I just ask a question from that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, please.
So does that also apply to population coding?
Yeah, so very much so. Very much so. So I've taken a very much a single neuron perspective here, but I believe the next lecture may be by Eric Shea Brown, who will specifically talk about population coding. So actually, there was just so much material in this lecture, I actually removed a whole section involving talking about trying to take a similar perspective with populations. So as you well know, you nowadays we record, 10,000 neurons, whatever, some huge number of neurons. But then you find that the whole system, the way it works, is actually when it's doing one thing or the other, there's some submanifold of k dimensions, whatever that may be, in this huge space that's sort of maybe wonky and curved in some way, and you got to find that manifold, and that's where the interesting stuff is happening. So you could view all of that in a similar kind of language, where what you do is you take this full space. There's some reason why you're embedding the computation this very high dimension. But then when you do a particular computation, you have these sort of this surface versus that surface versus this surface, possibly independent of each other in some appropriate sense of independent, that are carrying the computation and the dynamical information associated with that. So you can say many of the same things in that population context, but I didn't do so. I think Eric will be discussing many things about how you determine those things. And so in those cases, you might say, why are you using this coordinated population code, so making all the neurons independent? Well, there could be many reasons. So first of all, you have this general structure, and you want to be sort of redundant against noise. That could be one reason. Otherwise, if you've got one neuron encoding something, if it dies, you're dead, right? I mean, you certainly don't want that. But a more powerful reason might be if the input-output function you want, I've been talking about these boxes. It's very simple input-output functions. In comes some stuff, you route it this way or you route it that way. But what you really want to do is a computation. So what you want to do is you have this very complicated input, and you want to extract from it some very complicated thing, and then write that out as into some pattern. So it may be that the most efficient way to do that is to construct this gigantic network and allow this pattern of activity to represent such and such thing in the input, and that pattern of activity represents something. It may be just getting that into a single neuron can be a much more complicated thing than getting the dynamics to represent it. So that's just basically, you have to think about the entire population. In this language, you would think about the entire population as one vector of activity. And then you would think about the different vectors of activity in that way, right? Did that help? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. It'd be interesting to hear about that in the next lectures.
Yeah.
So I want to ask another question, is there some experimental evidence or some other theoretical evidence supporting the cost curve is convex?
So there's definitely plenty of evidence for the convexity of the curve, because a good amount is known about the biophysics of ATP consumption while neurons fire. So I think it's pretty clear that that's going to be the case. Experimentally, what you really want, what I would want, is I would want, I don't know, a neuron that glowed with a brightness that was related to the amount of metabolic activity. And then I would just like to measure as the thing fired, what this curve was. That's just not been done. Right? So it's not clear that it's impossible. I've said that in a very negative way. And it's perhaps clear that it is possible, because there are various fluorescent proteins. If you just go through the metabolic pathway, there are various proteins in that pathway that are fluorescent. So in principle, you could sort of measure their fluorescence and use that as a trace. But that hasn't quite been done. There's been lots of studies of metabolism sort of at a bigger scale, because it's definitely relevant for fMRI, right? Because fMRI is associated with the amount of blood being transported, and that's associated with the metabolic activity, and there are all these fine-grained relationships that people have worked at. But at this scale, that hasn't been understood. So this is why the data that I tried to point you at earlier involved this, looking at mitochondrial membrane density. You can basically section neurons and use EM, electron microscopy to see these things. Very recently, there was a very interesting paper by the lab of Thomas Clendenin in Fly, in which they imaged metabolic activity and the neural activity at the same time and showed relationships, not exactly this curve, but other relationships within these things. So I think these kinds of measurements are coming because it's, I mean, life is about metabolism, right? There's a very large fraction of animal life that's about eating. And the rest is reproduction, to a first approximation, right? And the brain is definitely expensive tissue, right? There's a Professor Susanna Herculano Hausel who's advanced the expensive tissue, whatever it is, there's the expensive brain theory, something or the other, about how the cost of operating the brain is a constraint in human evolution and this kind of thing. But anyway, it's definitely 10 times as expensive as muscle. So it's clear that it's expensive to do these things. So it seems, like a good idea to try to find ways of experimentally quantifying the cost and then asking in precise terms how that constrains the structure of computation. So what I try to do is to talk about the structure of really more of communication than a computation, and then try to argue that it would drive you to a distributed architecture in this way, because you kind of don't want to be up there, and you don't want to be down there. Neither this point nor that point is going to give you as much bang for the buck. So you want to be somewhere at this operating point. And then I try to justify that, at least in sort of things of the retina, there's some evidence for there being an operating point like that. That wasn't an adequate answer. But I hope it helps.
Yeah, it definitely helps. Thanks.
Hi, Professor. I have a question.
Yeah.
And the brain has so many neurons, and I think there are some redundancy, and these neurons waste our energy. And do you think the brain is now energy efficient and every neuron matters?
So if I understood the question correctly, the question was, the brain has tons and tons of neurons. Surely some of them are redundant, or at least there's plenty of evidence some of them are redundant. So isn't this highly wasteful? And so then why am I going on about efficiency? Am I correct in understanding the question?
Yes.
Okay, first of all, let's separate this into two questions. We keep talking, and I have been guilty of this myself, about the brain. But of course, there is such a thing as the fly brain and the human brain. And in the fly brain, not clear there's so much redundancy, by the way, right? So every fly's brain looks exactly the same, almost, at least a first approximation. And there are single neurons that do stuff that for us an entire circuit would be devoted for. So first I want to say that in some organisms, it really is much more constrained and limited in what it does. So having said that, so the human brain, and higher animals in general, are sort of designed for a much more flexible kind of computation. Also, and they learn different things, they learn more, they do different things. It's not clear to me that they're quite as redundant as you might think there. I think that this overcapacity is being used in representational ways or to produce robustness and things like that. It's also the case that for many of the higher animals, the death of the animal has a much bigger consequence, for the organism, for the species, than it does for flies. There's different styles of life. You can make many copies of individuals and let many of them die and they'll survive. But for a human, the death of a human is a big thing, right? So then you want to build in more safety factors and redundancies also into the system. So I suspect that there is an interplay there between how much redundancy you want and how much safety factors you want. Right? But this is just speculation, right? I'm not, and in some ways it's easy speculation. I'm not convinced that things are as redundant as they may seem at a first cut. I think the overcapacity is being used in other kinds of representational ways. It's used for cognitive capacities. It creates more flexible computation. Some of these ideas that I was talking about earlier on in the talk.
Thank you.
Great. So about the arguments that the steeper this curve and the more channels you are going to use is because this operating point is moving downwards, right?
That's right.
Mhm.
That's right.
Mhm.
So you can make it the what is this? Yeah, basically, if you flip it along the diagonal, if you flip this curve along the diagonal to get cost per information, then it goes like that, and so then, yeah.
I see.
Yeah, so that kind of thing also leads to tests, right? So if you have different bits of the brain where you can argue that the biophysics of the neuron or whatever leads to a different cost curve, then
Well,
you'd want to split to more or less channels.
But you have shown that like different neurons, right? Different kinds of neurons, they probably have different cost, and right, they use different firing rates. So you can also plot this, not for a single neuron, but for different neuron, right? Are
That's
they
right.
aligned?
So they're aligned. So the argument with the retina, wherever that is, that I was trying to draw earlier, was to try to align the different neurons by their mitochondrial densities and their information rates, and to try to relate them.
I see. All right, I think we're extending Vijay's lecture to 2 hours and 30 minutes from 8 to now it's 10:30. So I think Vijay needs a break. It's exhausting, and thank you so much for answering so many questions from us. Yeah.
So thanks on my part. Thanks for listening. And Chuan told me that everybody in this audience was, very heavily technically sophisticated. So I gave you a technical lecture. The next one will be much more neuroscience rooted and will be based on the circuits of the entorhinal cortex and the hippocampus, and focus on that. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah. All right. The next lecture will start at 11, right? In half an hour. All right.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Ben, do you want to stay a little and just